this computer. Probably just got a little acknowledgement of that. And I'll go through the agenda. So I'm going to start things off by giving a brief history about Muskoka Conservancy. And then I'll chat a bit about amphibians in general. And then I'll go a bit more specifically into our salamanders and a bit of background about them. And then how to identify the specific salamanders that we find here in Muskoka. And then I'll do the same for our frogs. So I'll chat a bit about the background of frogs and then how to identify the species that are found here. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'll share a bit about Muskoka Conservancy. So we are the Land Trust of Muskoka. We are a registered charity organization, and we've been around since 1987. So that's 36 years this year that we've been around and pursuing our mission to conserve and protect the nature of Muskoka. And as a land trust, the way that we do this is through land acquisition. So whether we have properties that are very generously donated to us by members of the community, or whether there are community groups that help to raise funds for us to purchase properties, or potentially funds and grants that we receive from the government to be able to purchase properties. All of the land that we are able to acquire is protected in perpetuity, so for all of our future generations. And as of this year, we are protecting 52 different properties across Muskoka. And this includes almost 4,000 acres of land, so we're almost at 4,000. Over 60,000 feet of sensitive shoreline, both on our major lakes like Lake Joseph and Lake Muskoka, but also some of our smaller lakes as well, which are just as important. And we're also protecting over 700 acres of wetland. So all of these areas provide really important habitat for many of our plants and animals, including a lot of species at risk as well, that are known for their numbers going down in decline. So we are very happy to be able to protect these lands for future generations and provide these habitats and protect these resources. Some of our properties do have trails on them as well that are accessible to the public, but most are only accessible through expert guided hikes through our Nature Quest series. And are protected strictly for nature conservation. I always like to mention as well that as a charity, we do rely on our members and our amazing group of volunteers to support, and they help us run many of our events and programs that we have throughout the year. So we couldn't do it without our members and our volunteers. And if you're ever interested in getting involved, you can always reach out to us. You can find our information on our website, which is muskokaconservancy.org. And I've also included my contact information on the last slide. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me at my phone number or email as well. But with that being said about Muskoka Conservancy, we'll jump into the big topic of today, which is about our amphibians. And so this slide might not be too exciting, but I always like to start things off with taxonomy. And look at the groupings of animals and how we get to where we are. So it also brings us back to high school biology class, I'm sure, but hopefully everyone remembers kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and genus. So the overarching kingdom that our amphibians belong to is the Animalia kingdom, which is of course the animal kingdom. They belong to the phylum Chordata, which is individuals that have a backbone present. And where we get into our amphibian is at the class. So the class is Amphibia. From there is where we get into our salamanders and frogs, as well as a third order of amphibian that many of us may have not heard of. So our salamanders belong to the order Chordata, and frogs belong to the order Anura. And we also have a order that's called Gymnophiona, and they are Sicilians. So they are a third order of amphibians that aren't found here in Canada, but they are almost like a worm, but they share a lot of similar features with our salamanders and frogs as well, but I won't talk too much about the caecilians since we don't have them here in Muskoka. And then, of course, there's the family, genus, and species where we get broken down further and eventually get down to the species, which I'll be exploring the specific ones that are found in Muskoka. So about the amphibian class, as I mentioned, it's broken down into 3 orders: the caecilians, our salamanders, and frogs. The word amphibian is actually derived from the Greek word amphibios, which means to live a double life. So if you think about that for a moment, and what does that mean? Why do amphibians have a double life? That's pretty interesting. You might be able to piece it together, but I'm talking about it in my next point as well. And the reason why they're considered to have a double life is because they're semi-aquatic animals. So most will spend time either on land or in water, or they'll spend time on both. So they live a double life as being aquatic animals and as terrestrial animals as well. They are ectotherms, so all amphibians are ectotherms, which means they're cold-blooded. So of course, that means that they require outside and external sources to regulate their body temperature. So for example, they get heat from the sun in order to warm themselves up. Excuse me. They also have moist skin. So oftentimes amphibians might get confused with reptiles. They're generally viewed and grouped together, but the difference is that amphibians have moist skin and reptiles, of course, have scales. So they have that hard-ish, scaly skin, but amphibians don't have that. Their skin is moist and they can actually breathe through their skin as well, which again ties into my next point. So they can breathe through their skin, both while they're in the water and while on land. And they can also breathe through gills or lungs. So some species may be able to breathe through their skin, gills, and lungs at various points in their life cycle. And some may only breathe through their skin, and some may only breathe through gills. But those are the 3 options that they have. Definitely more than the options that we have. They're also oviparous, which means that they lay eggs to reproduce. So individual or species that don't lay eggs and they have live birth are referred to as viviparous, but our amphibians are oviparous. And I always like to mention as well that, like pretty much all animals that are out there, there's always some exceptions and species that might behave a little bit differently than the others that belong in their group or in their class. So don't be surprised if you find an exception here or there that they might have a little bit of a different feature or characteristic as well. But this is the general standard that amphibians will follow. So across the world, there are 8,000 different species of amphibian. And so my first question for you guys is, how many of those species do you think we'll get and we'll find here in Muskoka that live here? I'll give you a hint in that there's 25 different species of amphibian that live in Ontario, but not all of them are found here in Muskoka. So does anyone have a guess? Wendy said 12. That is close. It's actually a bit more than that. So I'll take you up
18.
18 from Joanne. It's a little bit less than that. So we know it's between 12 and it's between 18. So anyone have one more guess? We've got 16, we've got 15, all great guesses, but it's actually 17. So we've got 17 different species that we'll find here in Muskoka. And so I'll start things off by chatting about the salamanders that we'll find here, and then we'll get into the frogs as well. So our salamanders and newts, so those that belong to the order Chordata, we've got 682 species worldwide. So if you think all 8,000 species of amphibian across the world, but only 682 of them are salamanders. So our salamanders can be identified by having at least one pair of legs and a tail. So I'm gonna turn on my laser pointer, point some things out to you guys, hopefully. Oh no, it disappeared. Oh, there it is. Okay, there we go. Bearing with me for my technical figuring out of things. So yes, our salamanders will have one pair of legs at least. So all of our species that you'll find in Muskoka and all of the species that you'll find in Ontario do have two pairs of legs. So you can see on our spotted salamander here, there's a pair of legs here and one there. But there are some species that only have their first pair of legs, and then the rest is their body and tail. The greatest diversity of salamanders is also in North America. So you might think of, salamanders and amphibians being found in Central and South America, but they're actually most common in North America because they are fairly well adapted to cooler climates. In terms of how to identify, there we go, our salamanders, the certain things that you'll want to look for include the patterning and colors that they have, both on their back and on their underside as well. So we'll see an example later on of when you really want to flip them over and take a look at their bellies as well to identify them. You'll also want to take a look at their tail and consider the length and shape of the tail. I find that considering the shape can be really helpful. So specifically for our species that are more aquatic and spend more time in the water, you'll notice that their tail is more laterally compressed. So it'll be compressed on the sides. And that's because it almost acts like the fin of a fish for swimming and propelling itself forward in the water. You'll also want to consider the presence of costal grooves. So that's what you'll see here on our spotted salamander here. So those lines that are running down the abdomen. And then you'll also want to consider the presence and absence of gills. So again, some species will have gills for their entire lives or part of their lives, and it can be a really helpful thing to consider to help identify them. So I'll talk a bit about the breeding of our salamanders as well, because of course that's what our webinar was named for, the vernal pools. So again, they are oviparous breeders, which means they will lay eggs. And some species will have internal and some will have external fertilization. So of course, that means that some species, the eggs will be fertilized inside of the body. And for some, eggs will be laid in the water first and then fertilized outside of the body. Some will have direct and indirect development. So direct development is when the eggs hatch and fully formed adult, but smaller versions of adult salamanders will hatch out of them. Compared to indirect development, where we have that larval stage. So with indirect development, eggs will be laid, they'll hatch into a larval stage, and then they will morph into their adult form. But there are some that will be hatched right out into adult, small version adult salamanders. And this actually ties directly into the next point, which is that some will lay their eggs in vernal pools, so those spring seasonal pools and ponds, and some will lay their eggs on land. So those that are laying their eggs in pools and in ponds are generally going to be those with indirect development that have that aquatic larval stage before transforming into adults. And those that are laying their eggs on the land generally don't have that larval stage that will have to go into the water, but they will just hatch directly into the adult looking salamanders. I'll also mention that eggs that are laid in the water have a second gelatinous coating around the entire mass of eggs. So you can see that, again, we've got a spotted salamander here, and you'll see that there's a second coating. So there's the individual coating for each egg, but then there's a second protected coating around all of them. and that is unique to our salamanders. So that's how you can tell the difference between frog eggs and salamander eggs, because frog eggs will not have that second coating. And yeah, I think that's all I wanted to mention for the breeding and reproduction. I think I am getting a bit of feedback from someone as well. I don't know if they're driving in a car, but maybe if you're able to mute yourself, it might make it a bit easier for others to hear if you're able to do that. So now we're going to explore all of our species that are found here in Muskoka. So we've got 7 different species of salamander, and that includes our newt as well that's found here in Muskoka. Our first one that we'll look at is the eastern redback salamander. This is one of our smaller species, only about 10 centimeters long, and it's actually the most common species in North America as well. An interesting study has been done that actually found that if you were to collect up all of the redback salamanders in a deciduous forest and total their entire biomass, so their entire weight, they would actually end up weighing more than all of the breeding birds that are found in a forest. So their biomass is even greater than, the peak breeding migration time with all of our birds in the forest, which is pretty cool, and just helps to make you think about how important these species are in terms of being a food source for all of the animals in the forests, as well as a source of carbon as well. So in terms of identifying these species, they have a slender black body with that reddish orange stripe that goes down the back. So you can really see it up here, that orange stripe, and then the grayish black body. They have really short and slender legs. So you can especially see here how short they are and how far they are between along the body. And so this can help you tell the difference between some of our other species like our mole salamanders, like the spotted salamander and the blue spotted salamander, that are more robust and they have longer and thicker legs. These individuals also have a speckled white underbelly. So you can sort of see it on this one down here that it's got that white speckling. And this one specifically is actually considered a leadback morph. So they're called the eastern redback salamander because they've got that red back to them. But there are some individuals that actually lack that red back and just have that same body coloration, the grayish, brown, black all around. And so they're still the same species, but they just don't have that red color to them. So that's something to be aware of as well. If you see something that you're not sure quite what you're looking at, it could be the leadback morph of the redback salamander. So they are found in deciduous and mixed forests, and they are one of our species that will lay eggs on the ground. So they breed in April and May, and they'll lay their eggs underneath rocks and logs, and they will hatch directly into adult salamanders. So they don't have a larval stage at all. And that is our redback salamander. Oh, I see a question from Wendy. She was wondering, are salamander eggs eaten by predators? So yeah, some animals will eat, some predators will eat salamander eggs. Generally, the biggest threat to them would be fish. And that's why when they are laying their eggs in water, they'll lay their eggs in vernal pools where they're small enough, and seasonal pools where there won't be any predatory fish in them. Okay, so next is our spotted salamander. It is one of our larger salamanders. It is about it can get up to about 20 centimeters long, and it is one of our mole salamanders. So they have, you can tell, a much more robust body compared to our slender redback salamander. And it's got a black body. Sometimes it can be a bit more gray as well. And it's got these large yellow spots on them. Sometimes they appear a bit orangish as well. So I've made a note. Why? Why do you guys think they have these large yellow spots on them. What are they trying to tell potential predators? Any guesses?
They're poisonous?
Yeah, exactly. They are poison, or yeah, they are poisonous. So all of our salamanders, all salamanders in the world, have some sort of toxin to them. And so generally they're brightly colored to warn predators, hey, you might not want to eat me because I don't taste very good and I'll probably make you feel bad. Um, the interesting thing about it, though, is that the toxins that they have in them are not strong enough to kill any predator that might eat them. And that's because that allows the predators to learn. So if it were just to kill them, those predators wouldn't carry on their genes and that learned knowledge that if we eat these animals, it won't be good. It'll make us feel really bad. So just enough to scare them off and pass that knowledge on to their offspring. So these individuals are found in deciduous forests as well, and their breeding will take place fairly early in March and April. They have internal fertilization, and their eggs are laid on twigs and other vegetation in vernal pools. And of course, then they will hatch and have a larval stage before transforming into adults. So to give a bit more in-depth explanation of it, males will actually move into the ponds prior to the females, and they will deposit what are called spermatoforms. So they're actually little pyramids with a deposit of sperm on top, usually around pieces of vegetation in the vernal pools that the females are more likely to lay their eggs on. And then females will make their way into the pools after. Males will actually do a bit of a courtship dance and swim around and try to impress the females and get them to collect their spermatoforms and use their sperm to fertilize their eggs and reproduce and produce offspring with them. But sometimes there's so many salamanders in one pool that there's just spermatophore on top of spermatophore, and there's really no way to guarantee that the female is actually collecting yours to fertilize her offspring. But there are quite a few videos out there that depict this, so definitely check those out. Give it a quick Google after today's presentation to see what that looks like. We got a question I see here. Are the eggs laid more at night or during the day? So they are laid more at night. So that's when they'll become more active. Usually after a nice rain, they like the moist habitats. So after good rain, they'll make their way into the ponds to perform their breeding. Good question. So I'll move on to the blue-spotted salamander next. So this is another one of our mole salamanders. It also has a fairly robust blackish gray body, but instead of having really truly formed spots on it, it's got these irregular spots and flecks on it that are blue in color. They are found in all sorts of woodlands, and their breeding is very similar to that of the spotted salamander. But it is to a lesser extent. So with the spotted salamanders, they're very well known for having sometimes hundreds of individuals in a pool during breeding, but it isn't quite to that extent with the blue spotted salamander. And in terms of differentiating their eggs, the blue spotted salamander tends to be less formed. So where the spotted salamander will be like very tightly formed and attached to vegetation and twigs in the water, the blue spotted is a little bit less held together. Next is our northern two-line salamander. So this is another one of our smaller species, about 12 centimeters long. And sometimes it is mistaken for our redback salamander as well. So these individuals have a reddish to orange body, and they have a light orange stripe that goes down the back and all the way into the tail. And because they have this stripe on their back, that's why they sometimes get mistaken for redback. But you'll notice that the stripe is also bordered by this black line, and that is something that the redback salamander will not have. When you take a look at their tail as well, you'll notice that the color gets a bit brighter on the tail. So usually you'll notice that's a bit of a brighter orange on the tail. It is also laterally compressed. So as I mentioned at the beginning, like it's compressed on either side. And that's because this species is associated with flowing streams that are found in woodlands. So this is another one of our more aquatic species that you'll actually find under the rocks in streams or logs in streams. And that's where they'll do their breeding as well. And you'll find their eggs laid under the rocks in the streams as well. So they need to be able to swim around. So they've got that nice tail that they can use to propel themselves forward. As a species that lays their eggs in the water as well, their larval stage happens in the water too. So they've got indirect development, not direct development. And sometimes their larvae will overwinter as well before transforming into adults. So for our blue spotted and our spotted that we just looked at, their larvae will have to transform before those vernal pools dry up in the summer. So they have a very quick transformation period. But with the northern two-line, since they're in these permanent streams, they can actually overwinter as larvae in the water as well. Next is our four-toed salamander. So they are about 10 centimeters long. They have this nice reddish orange colored body with a brighter colored tail as well. And you'll notice with the tail here that it's got a bit of a constriction as well. So all of our salamanders can lose their tails and regenerate them. But this one sort of has a bit of an added feature to make it even easier for them to detach their tail if a predator was coming after them. And this is the species that is really easy to identify by looking at their belly as well. So it's the only species you'll find that has this all white stomach with these black spots on it. So if you're maybe not sure what you're looking at and you flip it over and you see this, you'll know right away that's our four-toed salamander. You'll notice that I didn't even include that it has 4 toes as a key ID feature, because imagine trying to count all those toes. It can be a bit difficult when you're looking at a very small creature. And there's one really easy way to quickly identify it. These species are found in moist woodlands that are close to sphagnum bogs or marshes that has sphagnum in them. And that's because that's where they'll actually lay their eggs. So these species actually will breed in the fall time, and they have delayed fertilization, and they actually won't lay their eggs until spring. And they'll lay them in the sphagnum moss, and when they hatch out, they'll move into the water that's nearby and have their larval stage in the water. And then they'll come back onto the land and be terrestrial as adults. They're also one of our lungless salamanders. So they do not have any lungs. And of course, as adults, they also do not have gills. So they need to breathe through their skin throughout their adult stage of life. Next, we have our eastern newt. So this is our one newt species that we have in Ontario. Through all stages of its life, it will have a orange-red coloration to it. And it also is known for having granular skin. So that means it's got little bumps on it, like if you think about sandpaper with all of those little grains. These species are associated with permanent bodies of water as well, because as adults, they are actually completely aquatic. So they need to have a water body that, isn't going to disappear halfway through the summer. So their breeding occurs in early spring as well, and their eggs are laid in May. So their life cycle is a bit different than some of the other species we've talked about. So they'll start off with laying their eggs in the water, and that's where their larval stage will be as well. So this is their larvae at the top, and they've got gills during their larval stage. After their larval stage, they will go into their F stage, which is like a teenage or adolescent stage, where they are actually on land. And so that's what is pictured in the middle here. And as teenagers during this stage, they'll actually develop lungs. So they'll breathe through their lungs and skin. They'll stay in this stage for 1 to 2 years before they transform into their final stage as adults, which again returns back into the water. However, they don't redevelop their gills, but they actually retain their lungs. So they actually need to breathe air, and you can actually see them going up to the surface of the ponds that they live in to be able to get water and breathe through their lungs. So they're quite different. So if you remember when I said some species might be a bit different and be a bit of an exception to some of the rules, this is one that is a little bit different than some of the others. So our last salamander species that we'll talk about is our mud puppy. This is our largest salamander, so it'll grow up to 48 centimeters long, and it is fully aquatic. So it has these gills that are found on it throughout its entire life. As larvae, of course, they will be smaller, and they'll have 2 orange stripes that run down their sides. This is an adult pictured here, so they tend to be a brown color with darker spots on them. And that really helps them to blend into their surroundings, which is the rocks and logs that are on the bottoms of rivers and lakes. They also have granular skin as well. Their breeding occurs in late May and June, and females will actually stay with their eggs. So they have a bit of parental care compared to some of our other species, and you can find their eggs under rocks and logs in their habitats. So that is all of our salamanders. Does anyone have any questions about the salamanders before we move on to our frogs? I don't think I'm seeing or hearing any questions, so I will move on. Okay, so our frogs and our toads that are found here in Muskoka. We've got 10 species that are found here out of the 6,633 that can be found across the entire world. So if you remember, there's 8,000 in the entire world, and a very large majority of our amphibians belong to the frog and toad group, so the Anurin order. So these species, our frogs and toads, are recognized by being 4-legged with no tail, and they, again, can breathe through their skin, gills, and lungs through different times in their lives. And when you're looking at how to identify them, these are some of the things you'll want to consider. So you'll want to take a look at their dorsal side, so that is their back. You'll want to consider the different colors and patterns, whether it has stripes or spots and what colors those are. You'll also want to consider the coloration of their thigh for some species. So for not all of them does their thigh color matter, but there's a few that have some bright colors that can help to differentiate them from other similar looking species when you look at their inner legs. You'll also want to take a look at their feet and whether they have toe pads or webbing between their feet. A really helpful one, which we'll explore really shortly, is the presence of a dorsolateral fold. So if you look at our green frog down here, the dorsolateral fold is this sort of flap of skin that runs all the way down the back and along their eardrum as well, which is also referred to as their tympanum. And so that's another thing that you'll want to look at to help identify species. And specifically for our toads, you'll want to consider the parotoid gland and the presence of tubercles. So the parotoid gland is this feature on the back of the head here, and the tubercles are the little raised bumps or warts that are seen on the backs of our toads. I'll chat a bit about the breeding and reproduction of our frogs and toads, and then we'll get into the specific species and how to identify them. So again, they are oviparous, which means they are egg-laying species. One big difference between our frogs and our salamanders is that our frogs will have mating calls that they will do starting in springtime when the temperature starts to warm up to attract mates to breed with them. Eggs are laid by females into ponds, wetlands, and vernal pools, and they are fertilized externally. So males will fertilize the eggs once they've been laid in these different ponds and water bodies. The eggs will hatch. So this is what the eggs look like. Then they will hatch into the larval tadpole stage. And then eventually they will transform into the adult, fully grown frog as well. And again, you'll remember that the frogs do not have that second coating around the individual eggs. And that's how you can tell the difference between the frog eggs and the salamander eggs. If you want to tell the difference between frog and toad eggs, the way you do that is because toads will actually lay their eggs in a single line or in a string, whereas the frogs will lay their eggs in one whole mass. And so that's how you can tell the difference between the frog and toad eggs. Okay, so we'll start things off with the American bullfrog, our largest frog here in Ontario. So it'll grow up to 15 centimeters long, so probably bigger than the size of my hand, and some of yours as well. So quite a hefty frog. The main way to identify them is considering that dorsolateral fold. So you'll see here, it goes around the eardrum, but it does not extend down the back, which is what the green frog will have. So that's how you tell the difference between the two. They are found near permanent bodies of water, so lakes and big ponds, and that's because they need to overwinter in those areas, and their tadpoles will overwinter in those areas as well. They will start breeding a bit later than some of our early breeders. So in June through August, they will be calling and breeding. And their tadpoles will take about 1 to 2 years to grow before transforming. And of course, that means they'll have to be overwintering as tadpoles as well. And so we'll play their call now. And I'm sure most of us have heard this before. So a bit of a droning call the bullfrogs have. Next is our green frog. So they are found farther north than the bullfrogs as well. And they're slightly smaller. So they'll grow to about 10 centimeters long. Their dorsolateral fold, again, extends all the way down the back and around the tympanum. So you can easily tell the difference between the bullfrog and the green frog. They can also change color as well. So if you look at the head of this frog, it's green compared to the back end of it, which is more brown. And that's actually affected by temperature, can change what colors are appearing. They can be found in various different water bodies, as long as the water bodies have water that's deep enough for them to overwinter in. Similar to the bullfrog, they will lay their eggs over the summer through June and August, and their tadpoles will overwinter as well. And we'll listen to their call now. So that one sort of sounds like plucking a banjo string. I've heard it referred to sometimes. Next is our mink frog here. So sometimes this one can be confused with the green frog and the bullfrog as well. It is a bit smaller, so growing only up to 7.5 centimeters long. And it will have this brown and green mottling on the back. So it won't be one solid color, and it won't have obvious spots to it, but it will have this general mottling of colors on the back. It also has these dark spots on the legs as well. The dorsolateral fold is much less distinct, so you can't really pick it out in the picture here. It is also found in larger permanent water bodies. And compared to the two frogs that we just talked about prior, this one is much more flighty and skittish. So if you're walking by and, a pond or something, and a few frogs hop away, but a few will remain, and maybe you can identify them as the bullfrog or the green frog. You don't always want to assume that that's also what hopped away, because it could have been the mink frog, which is a bit more fearful of people and loud noises and will jump away if it hears something coming towards it. These species will breed throughout the summer through June and August as well, and their tadpoles will overwinter. And here we'll listen to their call. So it's quite a clacking, barking-like call. And it's often referred to as sounding similar to the wood frog as well. So a really important thing to remember when trying to identify some of these species as well is the time of year that you're hearing it. Because the mink frog will be calling and breeding in the warmer summer months, but the wood frog will actually be breeding and calling very early on. So in March and April, they'll start breeding. So depending on the time that you're hearing these similar calls, you can really easily tell which one it is based on that time of year. Next is our northern leopard frog. This species is found fairly far north, so up into Hudson Bay area. It's about 11 centimeters long that it will grow to. And again, it's got a very prominent dorsolateral fold that extends down the back. It has usually 2 or 3 rows of spots that will be going down its back, which are pretty roundly shaped. It also has this barring on their legs. So you'll notice that the barring that's on the shin will actually match up with the barring that's on the thigh as well. So it usually goes right across. This species is found in moist fields and meadows, and they will actually migrate to their permanent water bodies for hibernation. So sometimes you'll find them in these fields and meadows that are quite far away from any water body source. And that's because they will make a bit of a further trek for the summer seasons. They are early breeders as well, so they'll start breeding in April and May. And instead of overwintering as tadpoles, they will actually transform later in the summer or in the early fall before the winter comes. So we'll listen to the call for them. So it's a pretty long, extended croaking for our leopard frog. Next is the northern pickerel frog, which is often confused for the leopard frog, but this one is a more southern species. Their range does overlap, but the pickerel frog range doesn't extend past northern Georgian Bay, actually. They're a bit smaller as well, growing up to about 9 centimeters long. They also have a prominent dorsolateral fold. But if you take a look at the spots that are on their back, they're a bit more square, and sometimes they'll connect to each other and look more like a stripe. And in terms of the first stripes that are on the back behind the head, they will often touch the dorsolateral fold, whereas with the leopard frog, they're set in from the dorsolateral fold. This isn't something that you can always go by, because sometimes there's some variation as well. So the main ID feature to tell the difference is that the northern pickerel frog, if you take a look at their armpit and their inner thighs and their legs, you see that orangish color in there. And they will always have that orangish yellow inner thigh and armpit color that the leopard frog lacks. They are found near permanent water bodies that have seeps and springs nearby. So they're associated with groundwater. So when the groundwater is relatively close to the surface, they really like those areas. They also have early breeding in April and May, and their tadpoles will transform before the winter months. We'll listen to the song for the pickerel frog. So that one's often referred to as like a long snore. So like an old man snoring. Next, we have our wood frog. So this species is found the furthest north of all amphibians in North America. So it's found up way into the territories as well. It will grow to about 6.5 centimeters long, so generally considered a medium-sized frog, and it's quite easy to identify. So all of our wood frogs will have this dark mask on their eye and this white lip bar below it. They are found in woodlands. That's how they get their name, of course. And they're one of our earliest breeders, as I mentioned, breeding starting in March and April if it's warm enough. And they will breed in our vernal pools and ponds. And for that reason, the tadpoles must transform before those ponds dry up in midsummer. So they have a pretty quick turnaround for their tadpoles growing into adult frogs. These species, of course, being found so far north, also have to be able to tolerate freezing. They'll overwinter in the leaf litter and in depressions in the ground, where it can get quite cold and it can freeze. So if you guys think about water, as it freezes, it will expand, and it's often very sharp as well. So it's not round and soft, but when it expands inside of cells, it can actually damage and destroy the cells. So these species of frogs that are freeze tolerant actually can produce a natural antifreeze by increasing the amount of glucose that's found in the blood. And this will actually prevent the water from freezing within the cells, and it will make the freezing happen outside of the cells and therefore allow them to remain undamaged. So really interesting adaptations that are wood frogs and some of our other species of frogs have as well. We'll listen to their call. So again, that clacking call that you'll hear early in the season when they're breeding. Next is what I think was our group favorite, the spring peeper. So it's one of our smaller species, only growing up to 3.5 centimeters long and very easily identifiable by this X and cross that's on its back. So sometimes the cross and the lines of it might be broken up a little bit, so it might not be completely connected, but it will always cross in the center, and they won't run parallel to each other. They can also be identified by the very small toe pads that they have. So these species belong to the tree frog family. So they need to be able to have these little toe pads to be able to hold on to vegetation and trees that they are climbing on. They are found in woodlands that are nearby to wetlands and open water ponds. And they will breed in these ponds as well as in vernal pools in late March and early April. And of course, similar to our wood frogs, when they are breeding in these vernal ponds, they must be able to transform in midsummer, early fall, before ponds dry up so that they are able to survive all right. These species will overwinter in the leaf litter and in ground hollows as well. And for that reason, they have a degree of freeze tolerance as well. And so we'll listen to the call that I'm sure we've all heard and we all love to hear come springtime. So of course, that lovely peeping sound that they get their name for, very easily recognizable. Next is our boreal chorus frog that is found here in Muskoka. There is also the western forest frog, but it is found more in southern Ontario, and it's the boreal species that is found here. And this is our smallest Ontario species, so only growing up to 3 centimeters long. It has 3 lines that run along the back, which are often broken up as well. So of course, different than the spring peeper, they don't cross at all, but they run parallel. They also have a pretty distinct white upper lip as well. They're found in woodlands, meadows, grasslands that have vegetated ponds nearby that they're able to breed in, along with vernal pools as well. So similar timing as our spring peeper, they will start breeding in March and April, and those tadpoles will transform before the winter. They won't overwinter in those ponds, of course. They will overwinter in the leaf litter and in the ground hollows. So usually when I think of the chorus frog and their call, it sounds a lot like running your thumb along the things of a comb. So that's what its call sounds like to me. Next is our gray tree frog. They are about 6 centimeters long when they're fully grown. So another one of our medium-sized frogs. They have very, very granular skin. You can especially see in these individuals pictured here. And their color could actually vary. So it could be more of a gray, or it could be green, or a bit more tan as well. The species is another one of those species that you can identify easily by looking at coloration of their inner thigh. So on the lower picture here, you can see they've got a yellowish orange coloration on the inner thigh that is unique to them. They also have quite enlarged toe pads to be able to climb on vegetation. They're found in deciduous woodlands that are nearby to wetlands, and they're pretty unique for when they are calling. So they will call specifically only when the overnight temperatures are over 14 degrees Celsius. So I personally haven't, but I've heard that when people are monitoring for these species, if they go out in the evening and it's 16 degrees, you'll hear the frogs calling. But if you have a thermometer with you, and as soon as it hits 14 degrees, they'll stop calling. It's too cold. They're using too much energy. It's not worth it for them. So that's a very unique thing that's been studied in the gray tree frog. These species have freeze tolerance as well, and they will overwinter in the leaf litter and ground hollows as well. Here's their call. I think you could hear about 3 different species calling in that recording, but of course it was the most prominent trill, which to me kind of sounds a bit like a woodpecker's trill and call as well. So that's what helps me to remember the gray tree frog. I think it sounds a bit like a woodpecker. Our last species here is our American toad. So this is our one toad species that you'll find in Muskoka. In Ontario, we also get the Fowler's toad in Ontario, but it is only found on the shores of Lake Erie. So if you're seeing a toad here in Muskoka, chances are it's going to be an American toad, unless somehow a Fowler's toad hitched a ride up from Lake Erie. So they will grow to about 11 centimeters long. They're quite robust individuals. When looking at their parotid gland, it is kidney bean shaped. So you'll see there's a bit of an indentation in here that gives it that kidney shape. They have very large tubercles, which are those warts and bumps that are growing on the skin. And they'll have generally one tubercle per spot. Whereas with the Fowler's toad, if you are in an area where you'll find both, they tend to have multiple tubercles per spot. They also have, the American toad has dark spots on the underbelly as well, whereas the Fowler's toad will be all white with no spots on it. The American toad can be found in a variety of habitats. You can find them in fields, forests, meadows, and wetlands. They'll breed relatively early as well, in April and May, and they'll transform and emerge into toadlets in July. So often you'll see a really big outburst of all these toadlets come July, and you'll find them crossing all the paths and roads in front of you. So you really have to watch your step during that time as well. I included a little fun fact for the American toad as well. And that is that males will actually chirp and vibrate when they're squeezed. So if you want to find out if you're looking at a male or female American toad, if you pick them up sort of just behind the armpits and give them a little squeeze, if it's a male, they'll make this chirping sound and they'll shake a bit. And it's actually a reaction they have to tell whatever's grabbing onto them to let go. And that's because when they're all breeding in a pond, sometimes it can get a bit confusing. And sometimes another male will grab on to another male. And although the male that's been grabbed onto is very flattered, it will give this alarm call to say, just so you know, I'm another male. I'm very flattered, but if we want to be successful in creating offspring, it's not going to work. And that way the other male knows to let go. So you can give that a try. If you do, beware, you'll probably get pooped on as well. But sometimes it's worth it to see if they'll make that call, and you can find out if it's a male or a female. And so we'll listen to the call of the American toad. Oh, I see some people have said that they're not actually hearing the calls. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for letting me know. I had a feeling that there was a chance that they might actually not be heard, but I can send them to you guys after as well, so you guys can hear all the calls. So I'll try for our last American toad. Hopefully you guys can hear it. If not, sorry about that. So hopefully some were able to hear that. If not, I will send out the slides so you guys can check it out. But their call sounds like a very long trill. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation today about how to identify the salamanders and frogs of Muskoka. I'll extend the chat to see if I missed anything else in here. But if you guys have any questions, please let me know now, and I'll do my best to answer any of them. And if you have any questions that you come up with later, you can send me an email or give me a call.
I have a question.
Yes.
Oh,
Jennifer.
hi, Amanda. Jennifer here. Regarding the green frog, I have this fun little pond that I didn't really know that it would become a summer pond for the green frog. It's an area in a rock outcropping, which I dug out, and it fills with water, nothing even less than a foot in depth of water.
Mm-hmm.
And the stance is, it might only be about 8, not even 8 square feet, like maybe 6 by 4 feet or less. And it fills up with green frogs every summer, and they keep returning. It's really quite adorable. 2 summers ago, I counted 18 of them in there. And so they leave, and I was curious. I mean, I'm a little bit up from 3 Mile Lake. We're on kind of a rugged hillside, not too far away. There's a couple of little like creeks and other little like water flowing areas. Where do you think they hang out for the winter? Because they can't live in there. Like it just becomes ice.
Yeah.
And rock, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that might be a good area for them to hang out in the summer. Probably gets nice and warm in the shallow pond that you have created there. But chances are they'd move to any wetland that is nearby. So I'm sure there has to be one that's somewhere nearby that they'd be able to move to spend their winters and be able to survive. It's a good question. I'm not too sure based on my knowledge of the area, but there'd have to be somewhere that they could overwinter. But some of these species can move pretty far in the summer, and they'll move around and then they'll head back as well. So
yeah, I just think it's so cute how they really truly treat it like their summer vacation property.
Yeah.
And off, when the weather gets cold.
Yeah, they're just heading off to the cottage in Muskoka for the summer, and then heading back to hunker down for the winter somewhere.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll see if we've got some other questions here.
Amanda, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
What would be the greatest predator or the most significant predator of frogs?
Good question. I don't know like 100% off the top of my head, like what would be like the 100% correct answer. But
Right.
I'd like to think that Jennifer has said snakes or like weasels as well. So a lot of our weasels hang out around the water, like our otters and our mink. And so they'll eat a lot of invertebrates and like clams and things like that that are in the water. So I imagine they'd go after frogs as well. Oftentimes you'll see snakes chomping down some of our more terrestrial frogs as well. And birds as well can go after frogs too.
Would owls be a problem?
I'm sure owls would. I don't know if they'd be their favorite to go after, but owls will pretty much eat anything
Right.
that's smaller than them that they can get down, whether it's a snake or a little vole or mouse or frogs as well.
Yeah, we have a lot of frogs in our back bush, the deciduous bush back of us.
Yeah.
So I often wondered what's after them
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem. I'm gonna scroll up to see. There's a question about vernal pool mapping with Elaine from McMaster University. We have been reached out to by Elaine. I don't think we have finalized anything yet, but I think we are going to be involved with her vernal pool mapping that she's doing with McMaster. Is there any other noteworthy ecological functions of vernal pools beyond amphibian breeding? That's a good question. I'm sure it does provide pretty good ecological functions by providing like a wet area that is in a forested habitat. Most of my knowledge regarding vernal pools is tied directly towards amphibians and their use of them. So I don't have too much in-depth knowledge about some of the other functions that they have. Joanne asked about any speculations that have come up regarding climate change in amphibians. So I haven't done too much research into it, but like a lot of our different species, as climates are and temperatures are increasing and warming, it can affect the different ranges of species. It might affect the viability of eggs being able to hatch as well. Like specifically for ones that are being laid in vernal pools, if we get really, really hot summers early on, it might cause pools to dry up and water levels to lower earlier on, and therefore affect whether those eggs are able to hatch. So that's definitely one thing that could be affecting a lot of our amphibians in terms of climate change. Someone asked about the ear size and gender. I think I did see that mentioned earlier as well. And I'm not too sure. I actually haven't heard of that before. So I can't speak to whether ear size affect, like if you can identify the gender based on ear size. But definitely something I'll look into to see if that's true. Karen had a question about who eats salamanders. They're pretty well hidden, usually under rocks and logs. So potentially anything that's flipping those over, like bears could potentially go after salamanders. But also just as they're moving around in the forest, any sort of carnivore like foxes could scratch them up and go after salamanders. So any carnivore birds as well might go after them. But I think specifically with salamanders, a lot of them have those bright colors that tend to ward off predators. And predators learn pretty quickly that they're not the tastiest snack. So my inkling is that there aren't too many predators for salamanders, but there are some that will still go after them. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. And thanks to me, and thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you do have any other questions, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to answer any questions, and hopefully I'll see you for our next webinar as well. I'll stick around a couple more minutes to see if we get any more, but you guys can feel free to take off for the day, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Amanda. That was excellent.
Thanks, Jan. We'll see you later.
Yep.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, I think that's all. So I'm going to end our presentation now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.